Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the home front of the United States during World War I. Remember, this is the first time the United States has been involved in a major European conflict. How does this involvement, the biggest conflict that the United States had participated in up until this point, how does this change life for Americans back in the United States? And so we begin with the president. We begin with Wilson himself, someone who was politically very savvy and very capable. The one area where he had little experience was in foreign affairs. And his challenge once the US enters the war is to raise and equip and transport an army to Europe. The United States in peacetime at this point has maintained a very small army, comparatively speaking, the 17th biggest army in the world, and so a new army has to be raised, and the Germans are launching these offensives, gambling on the idea that the Americans aren't going to arrive in time to change the outcome of the war. And the truth is, at the end of the day, that Wilson does it. He raises a large army and successfully trains and transports it to Europe, puts the Americans into the fighting at one of the more crucial junctures in the war, and they're the deciding factor in bringing the war to an end at that point. While the United States has many volunteers who sign up to join the war, there are actually many American volunteers who join the French or the British army in the war even before their country has declared war on Germany. The United States also institutes a draft to require men of a certain age, I think it's about 18 to 40, something like that, to sign up to be eligible for the draft. And in general, the theme that we see happening here is a growth in the authority of the president. Growth in presidential control, presidential ability to use the country as the commander-in-chief, to wield it in a way that's most efficient in order to deal with what is not maybe an existential crisis to the United States, but is certainly a crisis situation. And so we see Congress giving the president more control over supplies of food, supplies of fuel, and the transportation network. Remember, this comes on the heels of the Progressive era, which sought to make the government more involved in society as a way of counterbalancing or as a counterweight to big business and big corporations. And so many progressives were quite enthusiastic about granting the president this type of power, granting the federal government this type of power, as in some ways a capstone to the progressive movement. The government becomes more powerful. It becomes more powerful as part of this moral conflict that World War I was increasingly presented as, fighting with the more democratic powers against older empires in Europe. This was seen as, again, consolidation and increase of government power in order to achieve social reform. So in some ways, these changes are seen as a capstone to the achievements of the Progressive era. On the home front, you have a significant change to work in the United States because you have 5 million men who join the American Armed Forces. And of course, this leaves new opportunities in the workforce for those who previously had been excluded or marginalized from certain fields. This includes new opportunities for women to take in factories or industrial agricultural work that previously had generally been reserved for men. Now, most of these women are younger, unmarried women, and once the war is over, they've reached an age where they're going to get married, where they're going to raise children, and they return to more traditional occupations. But it's possible to see how the mold has been changed or broadened, and the mindset of these women who are raising daughters themselves has been changed in their attitude to work. So it's not as though you see a dramatic change in the way women are working immediately, but definitely culturally speaking, you now have an example of women participating all across the workforce. The other, of course, marginalized group is African Americans. The other major marginalized group is African Americans. And what we see is that African Americans are now moving into cities and working in northern cities, that there are new opportunities for them to leave the Jim Crow South and to come to northern cities, to come to regions of the United States that are more receptive to a more racially diverse population, to work jobs where they can be more successful. And so this leads to what's called the Great Migration, where you see large numbers of African Americans moving into northern cities for the new opportunities that are offered to them there. You also see an increase in Mexican laborers. Remember that Mexico is going through a period of instability and revolution during this period. The United States needs new supplies of labor. With the war in Europe, for the first time in a number of generations, you're not seeing large numbers of European immigrants providing a labor market or a labor supply for the United States. And so instead, we start to see large numbers of Mexicans, around 100,000 over the course of World War I, coming into the United States, both because there are fewer opportunities for them and more violence in Mexico, and also because the United States economy needs those laborers. So we talked about politically how World War I is changing the United States, more power for the president and the federal government. Economically, we've talked about how it's changing the workforce, changing the dynamics of the workforce. The last way in which World War I changes the home front, changes life at home in the United States, is again political, sort of social political. And that's in the way, first of all, that there's this effort to create and to emphasize being Americans over and above the ethnic backgrounds of the different immigrant groups who have moved to the United States, especially once the war begins, German backgrounds. Previously, we have a lot of immigrants who've retained speaking German, writing in German, having German newspapers. The association of Germany with sinking of American ships, with the enemy that the Americans are fighting against, leads to a real kind of sanitization or whitewashing of German heritage in the United States. So German street names are given American names. The German language is used much less frequently. We even find accounts of not many, but enough, of Germans being lynched as being seen as the enemy, and even those who lynched Germans being acquitted. So there's an effort to remove German memory, German history, German cultural influence within the United States. This, in part at least, not so much the whitewashing of German cultural heritage, but perhaps the effort to unite the American nation in an American conflict against tyranny is driven by a government agency, the Committee of Public Information. That was tasked by the president with providing speeches, with producing films, with analyzing newspapers, to make sure that the public is receiving the propaganda message that the US government wants it to receive, that the public is receiving the support for the war and the promotion of the war that the government wants it to be receiving. And this is combined with further increases in the power of the federal government, most notably the Espionage and Sedition Acts. These acts which restrict freedom of speech in a way that we haven't seen in American history since the late years of the 18th century, so more than 100 years previously. But we see these upheld by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decides that freedom of speech can be restricted in circumstances where it would be a danger to the nation. And so this is, again, part of the expansion of government influence and government control over the lives of American citizens. So I think that gives you a pretty good understanding of how the war is changing life at home in the United States. And then in the next video, I'm going to talk about life after the war and the effects of the war.